Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Epistemology is the philosophical system associated with knowledge claims. But no matter how many brilliant people devise the endless rules for how we categorize knowledge, a true philosopher always has a nagging question. But how do we know we know? If left unchecked, this regressive line of questioning can take us to some strange scenarios. Skepticism is the Ouroboros of the philosophy world. Much like the snake that eats its own tail, skepticism is at once what makes philosophy possible and what threatens to destroy it. All right, so I butchered that name again.
No. Well, it's fine. It's not like it gets talked about every day. Yeah. The snake that eats his tail, we all recognize that. But Ouroboros is a mouthful.
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of those things. This happens to me all the time because I'm widely read, but I'm also reclusive. So I read a lot of words, but then I don't say them. So I just, in my head, I come up with what I think that it sounds like. But then when I go to actually pronounce it, and I'm like, oh, I don't think that's how that's said.
Yeah, but that's
so today we're doing something for the first time, probably in the first of many times, and that is doing a part 2 of an episode. So we've discussed skepticism in the past, and I would encourage listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode, to go back and listen to it. It's a difficult discussion. I'm kind of learning some things about skepticism as we're talking about them, and we cover a lot of groundwork and a lot of history about it. And I'm sure in this episode we'll cover some of the things that we covered in that episode, but we're going to try to get into some more sort of abstract or conceptual questions about skepticism in this episode. But we're into our 73rd or 4th, something like that episode. So it's only a matter of time, right, before we start to revisit some of these things that we've talked about in the past. So let's start by picking it apart a little bit more than we did last time. What are some components of skepticism?
At its base, skepticism it questions the reliability of knowledge claims. So we had a lovely epistemological discussion very recently, last time, and as you said in the introduction, they're one leads to the other in a sense. One nips at the other's tail. But really what it comes down to, and what it has come down to across the millennia, is the idea of how reliable, how strong is any claim of knowledge that you make. And which also then makes one think, well, what do we mean by strong, and how do we get there? And that's where the relationship is between the two.
Okay. So is there something that separates skepticism from merely questioning or doubting something?
Yes, because at base, skepticism is focused on. It's not a destructive force, although it can be if it's untamed, and you were referring to that. And so at base, what it's trying to do is to determine if knowledge is possible. And if knowledge is possible, what kinds of claims do we make? How careful are we about making them? Are they bigger claims than we ought to be able to make? But it's all about eventually, I think optimistically, trying to get to a place where we can be not absolutely certain ever, but we can be more certain about some things.
Okay. So yeah, it's almost, I think that there's a systematicity to it where, questioning, you can question something and really not have an aim or direction. Same thing with doubting, right? You can kind of be like, okay, well, why is this way? And then you can ask a completely other off-base question, or you can just say, well, I'm going to doubt this thing just because intuitively it doesn't feel right. Yeah. Whereas skepticism is sort of it's a process, right? So you're You're looking at something and then you're kind of logically examining it and then asking questions that are specifically meant to kind of define the base of knowledge or the problem or whatever it is that you're examining,
right,
in order to determine what it's about.
And that can be done with total disingenuity. It can be disingenuous, which essentially means that it can be done with the purpose of trying to upend something that doesn't need to be upended in that way. So it can, in other words, be done by people who just want to poke holes in things, even though they don't believe that those questions that they're asking are questions that ought to be asked.
Yes, I have friends who are lawyers, and they love doing this kind of thing just for fun, right? So they just like to argue. If there's a good chance that if you're a lawyer as your profession, you probably just like to argue, right? And that it's. In some cases, I think it can be malicious, but in the cases of these guys, I think it's mostly just an exercise, right? Yeah. So it's like, I'm going to take a position that maybe I know is false, or maybe, I know is difficult to defend, just because I want to see if I can argument my way out of it. And in that case, it's disingenuous in that case, because rather than trying to arrive at the truth, you may actually phrase things or specifically avoid certain questions in order to be deceptive, or to try to present an argument in an alternate light in order to portray it as being truth or as the stronger position.
Certainly.
When in reality, you might intellectually know that it's not.
Rhetorical misuse has happened since the sophists. So we've talked about that before. But if you think of it as in a gamesmanship kind of way, or a gaming way, skepticism is the kind of process in which you take the attack, or you take the play right to the home field, being the home field of whatever in professional field you're talking about. So it's not like you invite the doctors over into the skeptical place. No, you go to the doctors and you say, here are a bunch of questions, right? Medical questions, for instance. And so it's portable, right? That way.
Okay. So do you think that there's a tension between emotion and logic in skepticism?
There has been for probably as long as skepticism in a formal sense has existed, because there are the rationalists who say that the logic and reason are the basis for everything, and then there are those who say that the emotional, intuitive capacity of the mind is what can lead to some pretty stunning skeptical results.
Yeah, it's funny. We were just talking about this actually before we started the episode. You and me and my wife, we were talking. When we do projects around the house, my wife is the type who she's emotional. Like, she thinks, okay, well, I want to get this thing done because I think it will improve stuff. So I'm going to jump in and do it. But when she involves me in the projects, what happens is I look at it rationally, right? And I say, well, here's this, and this reason that this might not work out. And she says, well, why are you being so pessimistic? And I'm like, well, no, I'm just thinking about it logically. But in reality, what happens time and time again, right, is so here I am thinking that I'm just being completely rational, pointing out what sort of issues we'll run into and trying to think of ways to mitigate them. And what she's saying is, well, you're being negative about it. Like, we should just jump in and try to do it. 9 times out of 10, if we just jump in and try to do it, it works out fine, right? So I think that there's something to be said about that, right? And when I was in the military, they talked about this a lot. The capabilities of a human are far beyond what a human thinks their capabilities are, right? Mm-hmm. If you're put into a scenario, you can do much more than you think. And you can even sort of, hack your mind in something that's not a life or death scenario where there isn't adrenaline and all that stuff. If you can get past it and say, all right, well, I'm just going to keep going, right? I'm just going to keep doing this thing, or I'm going to try this or whatever. So there are some cases where we might think we're being totally rational, right? But in a way, my wife is right. On a scale of, with 0 being completely pessimistic and 10 being completely optimistic, I'm probably a 4. So when I'm laying out these rational things, I'm not being completely objective. And so as a result, I'm throwing in some obstacles, or I'm thinking things are going to be a little bit more difficult than they're actually going to be. And so here I am designing this big master plan and trying to avoid these issues that don't turn out to be real. Whereas in some cases, if we just jumped into it, right, our ingenuity and our creativity and our intellect and these sorts of things would be able to pretty easily overcome most of the obstacles that we would encounter normally. So I think that that's a pretty good example of this sort of balancing act between emotion and logic, right? I think that in philosophy, we tend towards the logical, the rational, and people tend to say, well, there's, you're trying to strip emotions out of it as much as possible to get down to the brass tacks. Yeah. But humans are inherently emotional creatures, and that emotion can play a powerful role in shaping cognitive processes and how we come to solve problems.
Yes, and if emotions are vilified, which they have been, in the long sweep, if you take the long view on any ism, but with skepticism as we are now, the push and pull of, we need to be, the rationality is king, and emotions have to be put aside, or emotions surface and rationality gets beaten back, and all kinds of combinations in between. This has been a push-pull since the start. And it leads to, when you're going for primarily the rational route, or depending upon logical argument, then you tend toward the bigger picture kinds of things, systemic kinds of things. But sometimes that gets dismantled by not an overabundance, because that suggests a judgment, an abundance of an emotional or perhaps intuitive approach generally probably leads to more micro kinds of discussions or concerns. And I think both are necessary.
Yeah. And, and that, I think that bears out anecdotally in my experience. And lots of times, if you're taking those big system views, you come to conclusions that are notably erroneous because of the way that small things have ripple effects, right? So I can come up with this big picture plan, but if one little thing goes wrong at the beginning of that, it echoes throughout the whole thing. And by the time you get to the big picture, it doesn't look anything like what it looked like originally.
House ownership is like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. If you're doing projects, you've experienced this.
Yes.
So yeah, it's interesting. So let's talk about logic a little bit. We toyed with the idea of devoting a whole episode to it. But you sort of brought up the fact that logic, as important and sort of monolithic as it is actually pretty simple. And it's considered one of the pillars of philosophy.
Yes.
So it does deserve some sort of recognition, but there's probably not enough to fill up a whole episode. But I think in the context of skepticism, talking about logic is an important.
It is, because logic is the two. Like, I over-reduce it, but that's what we do so we can have the discussion. The two parts of logic are making an argument that holds together, and then examining that argument. Well, skepticism is about inquiring. The word itself, skeptikos, meant inquirer. And so inquiring minds want to know, where that comes from, that tabloid from forever ago. And so the idea of thinking about an argument you're really, the second part is what holds with skepticism. The questioning one does about the soundness of an argument or the scope of an argument that has been made. And again, that goes back to, do you have adequate grounds for assertions or assumptions that you are making? So skepticism, I think, applied authentically, is about trying to determine those grounds, trying to increase or reduce the scope of a particular statement, trying to mitigate dogmatism or ideological line towing so that you can see or attempt to bring light into what may be accepted without the questioning that needed.
Yeah, and this is something we kind of covered a little bit last week with epistemology. Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of the key to what we were talking about. Like I talked about in the intro, you have the skepticism being the snake eating its own tail, right? Skepticism is what makes philosophy possible, but it also is what threatens to destroy it, right? And I think that some of that does come back to logic. And like we were talking about in the epistemology episode last week, there's flavors of skepticism, right? Not all skepticism is created
exactly.
equal.
You have extremist skepticism in the sense of saying or that all knowledge is suspect. In fact, knowledge might not even be able to exist. The only thing that you can put any stock in, so to speak, is your immediate experience. That's really extreme, but it's used by people, of course. And then it goes down to the very micro, the very limited kind of skepticism, which then this is where it's brought to bear in specific instances or situations or field-specific problems.
And it's interesting, right? Because in science, right? I'm working in psychology. Psychology is a science, right? You use the same scientific method, processes, and these sorts of things. What I find interesting is, so different theories and different paradigms within science, you never prove them. They can be disproved. You don't prove them. You just have evidence that supports them. And what you find in a lot of cases is that certain models are useful in certain situations and not others. So rather than a model being true, right? Okay, we have this model of the brain, and this is the way that it is. Instead, it's, okay, well, here's a model of the brain, and if you're studying behavior in a social context, this works. But here's a different model of the brain, and if you're studying cognition in an individual context, this works. Mm-hmm. But if you tried to swap them, they wouldn't work. Does it make the theories invalid? No. What it means is that, okay, this thing has plenty of support for working in this instance. One of those things, I'm wondering if skepticism in some ways can be used similarly, right? If we use like an information processing model of the brain, right? You look at the brain and how you acquire knowledge physiologically. Mm. So you have sensory input, and then you have working memory, and then you have long-term memory. To me, the interesting part about that for a skeptic would be the sensory input. Sensory input happens in just, fractions of a second, right? So light hits your eye, sound hits your ear, your fingers come in contact with a surface. That sensory input is not something that you cognitively understand. Those signals then travel to your brain, they undergo processing, and are entered into working memory, and that's when you actually perceive what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. So that's when I see you sitting in a chair, or I see the color blue, or whatever it is, I hear your voice, these sorts of things. But by that time, even though it seems instantaneous to me, there's an amount of processing that's already happened. And some people this might be kind of a mind-boggling thing, right? Like, well, how does that work? The best example is if you touch your hand on a hot stove, right? If you touch your hand on a hot stove, you will automatically pull it back before you think about pulling it back. Before you even feel that it's hot, your body will just do it because all of that processing in your brain isn't taking place. The message is just getting to your amygdala. Your amygdala is saying, pull your hand away. So when we think about these extreme skeptical claims, right? These people that say, well, you can't trust anything but your immediate experience. And then you think about the brain physiologically and all of the processing that takes place and the coloration or the subjective things that are introduced by just that gaggle of neurons that we've developed and have, grown over our lifetimes that are all individual to each person.
Yep.
It makes you wonder, well, maybe is our subjective experience something that we can skeptically question, right?
Yeah, and that's you've brought up a zone, stew really of elements that have been the crux for feeling like people making the assertion that David Hume's work nearly made it impossible, nearly made philosophy impossible. And even if it weren't that apocalyptic, it certainly had that kind of rippling effect. And Kant moves on from that and essentially says, well, there is a priori knowledge of universals that seem to that exist, and we seek those that are steady and whatever. But then there's the immediate experience of the common sense, the ordinary life, which doesn't see those things, but it tries to take in what it is seeing, hearing. Descartes was all about that. If Descartes really launched this idea, which is still part of the discussion, although not necessarily as strongly in some quarters, that you have to suspend belief in enter this suspensive kind of space to then one by one, little by little, decide whether or not you can have some kind of partial assurance that what's coming in is worth thinking about or not deceptive or all kinds of words for it. The suspension, as if one is putting you could picture from the 70s, the 60s and 70s, this was a big deal when you could put somebody in a tank, cover them up, give them oxygen, but they can't see, they can't hear, and what that does to them psychologically. That's sort of the suspension that Descartes may have been thinking about, so that you don't just assume anything. You slow way down and try to examine what comes in. Well, that has been riffed on since Descartes in a variety of ways to try to acknowledge that there are things that we perhaps don't have the capacity to understand at all, or yet, but maybe at all. And there are things we certainly can come to some knowledge, or reasonably certainly can come to some knowledge claims about. So what you described leads to that it's almost like the hound of the Baskervilles, the Moors, where if you step in the wrong spot, you're going to go under, and you're not going to come back up. But if there's a path through all that foggy quicksand.
Yeah, and finding it is difficult the more experience you have with the other, right?
Yeah.
So as a psychologist or an aspiring psychologist, right, this is something that fascinates me. We recently had sort of an experience with this. We went over to eat dinner with my mom, and she has a 94-year-old neighbor that lives across the street by herself in a big house. And she showed up on the front doorstep with her face bruised. And she was holding a plastic bag with her home phone and her remote control for a TV in the bag. And she said that they didn't work. And then she fell and lost her glasses somewhere. And so I was walking down the road in the dark. I found her glasses and a phone book she was carrying for some reason. And we took her back. And when we took her back and my mom was trying to get a hold of her daughter to come, take care of her, just sort of observing and seeing what was going on, right? And seeing, it was a very individual circumstance, because we've all had experiences with people who have dementia or Alzheimer's or these sorts of things, but hers was very different. She was very aware of her surroundings and what was going on, and she was very spry, but she just had terrible judgment, right? So she would just do things, and she would say immediately afterwards, "That's not right. I know I shouldn't do that," that sort of thing. But she kept trying to do things that she probably could have reasonably done several years earlier. And watching this, right, I'm thinking her reality is different from my reality, right? And in a very obvious way. And then when you extrapolate that out and you start to see, you start to look at groups of behavior, right? You see how African Americans or women are treated or how they behave, and you think, well, their reality, what they experience, is different from what I experience.
Yeah.
And then you extrapolate that out further in a metaphysical sense into, well, we're all just humans, right? How different is our reality from an animal's reality? Or if there were no humans, what would there be that could be considered reality when you remove the anthropic principle, right? This is kind of the core of skepticism. The more you examine, the more you take yourself out of your own perspective and start to look at things from different ways. And again, as an aspiring psychologist, the animal thing really gets to me, right?
Sure,
reading an article about the cats and realizing that a cat doesn't have the prefrontal cortex to understand the concept of the future. So if you leave for 5 minutes to get groceries, or you leave for 6 months and then come back, to the cat, it's all the same. You were there, now you're back. Now, their memory might have faded of you, and that will lead to a different response. But cognitively or emotionally, if you can say that, the response is the same because there's no projection into the future. That perspective right there, right? It's almost enough to break your brain, right? Like, oh my, like how could you live? How could you have sensory input in many cases that's much sharper than humans, and have cognitive, things going on, but have no conception of the future, right?
Mm-hmm. It's boggling.
Yeah.
And the questions, and I don't have the capacity to, other than anecdotal, get into the idea of animal. Animals, I wouldn't have what we call a true belief or justified true belief, right? Which is really the basis of skepticism. But the very fact that animals exist, we don't know quite how they function and so on, is filled with possibilities to then take questions about that back to our own sense of time or our own sense of...
And especially when you see real strange ones, right? Like if you see a shark, which has almost no brain, but this immense central nervous system. Or you see an octopus that has almost all of its neurons spread evenly throughout its body, and it's like it has almost the capability of a brain in each arm, right?
Yeah.
And what purpose does that serve? That why doesn't it just have neurons that send messages to a brain and send them back? Is that too slow of a process to encourage survival? Probably not. So why all the processing power in the arms? Why? What? You think about these things.
Oh, yes.
And it's like...
There are wonderful books about I'm trying to remember the title of the most recent one. It was a few years ago, but it's specifically about the octopus. And it just makes you see everything freshly again by thinking through this. So that is, you're right. That's what skepticism is not. Although everyday usage of it sometimes implies this, it's not cynicism. It's not closed-mindedness. If it's authentic, what it is the opposite of that. It's an open but cautious attempt to approach things. And with the idea of gaining something. So in a very strange sense, and I'm on shaky ground with this because I'm not a hunter, but I think metaphorically it might work a little, or analogically, in a very strange sense. The careful hunter who approaches the process, whether it's a photographer hunting for a shot or a deer hunter or whatever it happens to be, you can just barrel in and your results might get lucky, but they probably aren't going to be very good. Or you can, as you were talking about before, you can prepare, anticipate, methodically approach things, say, wait a minute, why would it go here? Why would I think it would be there? What are my reasons for searching this out? That's really skepticism applied. It's wishful thinking is not skepticism, and that's what frustrates me sometimes in our current environment, because we have an undue amount of wishful thinking. I don't want to do this, therefore I'll say it doesn't exist. If something is bothersome, like COVID, well, it just doesn't exist. It's a hoax. It's something else. Well, that's really easy to say. It makes the boogeyman go away, seemingly. But it doesn't. It leads to deleterious effects.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode. I think that if you're relying on simplistic knowledge, right, you might come up with something that is a reliable claim, but that isn't valid, right? And you see a lot of that, especially with the consumption patterns of modern knowledge focused in social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of memes or posts that say, well, because of this, that, and here's the evidence for it. Well, I can get you in a lot of trouble, because the funny one that an interesting one I just had in my statistics textbook, right, said there is an almost perfect correlation between the usage of Microsoft Outlook and drowning in pool deaths, right? So it's a reliable claim to say the more somebody uses Microsoft Outlook, the greater the chances they will drown in a pool.
But It's not a causal.
There's no causal effect, right? It's not
right.
a valid premise, and you see a lot of these things.
The person who uses Microsoft Outlook may also be a person who's going to drown.
Yeah,
and so the mind wants to say, oh, then this leads to that, but no, that's where the skepticism. Why would I think that? What are the other data? What are the data really saying? But one needs a desire to poke, but equally, and perhaps even more so, the desire to think about what it is that one has found and how it fits. Not, I want to. So conspiracy theories are not skepticism. Just like faith is not the same thing as empiricism, right?
Because it's kind of the directionality of it, right? You're starting with an assumption, and then you're trying to find supporting evidence for that assumption, rather than, like you said earlier, just being open and saying, well, wait a minute. If this is the way something is, what sort of questions can I ask to get at what the truth of it is,
Searle, who was working primarily in the 19th century into the early 20th, but said that there's an inner and there's an outer. Well, he's not the first one to say it, and that won't be the last. But he came back to the idea of the apake, the suspension, the suspending the basic beliefs. He went back to Descartes and he was saying, okay, you mustn't assume anything. Take in what you're seeing, however you're taking it in, and then try to figure out what you can do with that in contextualizing or rethinking the problem, whatever the problem happens to be. So we have basic experiences, and then we have the external world. And sometimes we say we have basic experiences of the external world, but there are people who argue that all the experiences we have are totally internal. Even this one might be all internalized, right? And for those folks, and And that leads to a kind of thing called solipsism, in which the only thing that exists is the alone self. That's what solipsism is an alone self. And so if we cannot prove existence of anything but our own thoughts, then we're saying we know nothing of the external world. Well, and philosophers try to bridge that in various ways to say, well, what can we know of the external world? Is there anything we can have justified true belief or some true belief about that actually exists beyond our own perceptions? And that's all skepticism.
Yeah. And the human brain is like just the perfect encapsulation of skepticism, right? You could have the extreme skeptics that say, and they're not wrong, right? That so everything that you experience happens in a brain that has no sensory capabilities of its own and is just inside a thick bone skull. And that's all there is. But the interplay between philosophy and science, and starting with, a point of and then starting from what's the word I'm looking for? A beginning belief, and then working off of that is to say, okay, well, that's true, right? Everything that I experience is inside a bone case with something that has no sensory input of its own. But there is physical systems that connect that brain to the outside world. Now, the other fallacy would be to say those sensory systems that connect to that brain are telling me everything there is to know about the world. No, because we look at it further, right? And we say, well, no, we know that this eyeball, this physical thing, is only capable of seeing certain types of light. And we know that this ear is only capable of sensing certain sounds and these sorts of things. So as a result, we're getting some picture of what's going on, but we're not seeing the whole picture. And the accuracy of the picture comes back to that brain in the case and how it's integrating this information and how it's doing this stuff.
I'm going to jump in with this, and you can say, no, we shouldn't go there yet. But this is why I love to read philosophy about pop culture, and there's a whole series of these. Mark White and other editors who take an academic approach to. So my library is replete with these, and some of them are about horror. And this is, I told you before we started, this has got me thinking about some fresh article writing about a topic that I like to go into. But when you think about, and I read a piece in one of these books to prepare for today that just turned all the lights on. It was really fun because Descartes said, consistent with what I can verify in my experience, it could be the case that everything that appears to me is the creation of an evil demon, and that the world as I know it does not exist. And if you take that and extrapolate a bit into Stephen King land, the horror realm, whether film or literature, you can say accurately that skepticism, in a sense, threatens ordinary reality or ordinary belief. And it's not hard to do. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's potent. That's why it needs to be applied with either some intent from a literary viewpoint. I'm going to scare you. I can whip up a ghost story and I'm going to scare you, even though we're sitting right here in the light. We can get a shiver, right? And so horror dramatizes this, that the ordinary can go berserk at any moment. And we don't want that. And this is where it goes back to Hume, who said the reason can't save us. So you think, well, okay, if I go with the ordinary scenario, it could be possible that I might turn into a zombie at some point. Nothing's telling me I can't. Okay, let's tell a good story about that. I think that's probably it's fun in a sense, but it also illustrates the power of skepticism.
Yeah, and that's an underlying principle of reality that adds that grounding measure to skepticism. That's consistency, right? And that's what I was experiencing watching my mother's 94-year-old neighbor, right? Is that I don't believe that her reality was a consistent thing from moment to moment. And that, if that were to happen, that is where your logical principles start to break up, right? How could you be truly skeptical in a logical, rational way and establish knowledge that you could trust if the reality you were experiencing was not consistent from moment to moment?
Yeah.
The fact that it is consistent from moment to moment is the only thing that allows us to say we have basic principles we can work off of to examine what is real, what we know.
And then we ask, and are those basic principles woven into the fabric of the universe and therefore a priori, or are they things that we have created as our basic principles currently?
Yeah. It's fascinating. So we talked a lot about the formative aspects of skepticism in the first episode. We've touched on a little bit of them here, Hume and Kant and that sort of thing. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the history of skepticism or people who contributed to it before we move on?
Well, I think we've mentioned some of the regular players, but I don't think the one thing I'll mention, then we can go where you want to, is the postmodern skepticism. And I think we can sense this going on now. We are in the postmodern age. And is the work of people like Jean-Francois Lyotard, who said that was skepticism of systems, of whole systems. That the postmodern skepticism is a skepticism of anything meta, the meta structure, the meta narrative. And so that put that up against when people talk about the greatest generation, the narrative of World War II. Well, the narrative of World War II gets caricatured in some ways, so that the ugliness, the horror, and the not so black and whiteness of much of it has faded into that structural narrative of the heroes. Undoubtedly, there was heroism, and not a relativistic thing, but the idea that there was an awful lot of ugliness that went on that didn't necessarily have to either. And if it did have to, then it's not nearly acknowledged as much as it ought to be. And the tale of the marvelous hero becomes that Greek mythology kind of thing. And postmodern skepticism says you have to take that apart if you're going to find out what it is that you're really made of. It's sort of an atomistic psychological philosophy.
Yeah, I saw a meme this week, and it just had a picture of a guy's stern face, and it said, the World War II vet watching you play a video game of the worst day of his life. Right? And that sort of encapsulates that, right? Is these, you might be playing a game and you think that it's this fun thing, or it has this heroic narrative or whatever.
Right.
It was the worst day of somebody's life. Somebody was out there watching people die, barely surviving, doing these sorts of things.
Yes.
Yeah, and that is important, right? Especially when we're looking at history.
I think so. I think that the structural, and I'm not suggesting, I don't hold that everything ought to be dismantled down to the totally unrecognizable. I think it should be not dismantled. It should be archaeologically revealed. I think that if you're going to have a system, then you better make sure that system is answering the questions that need to be answered about how the system was developed. And that's really the questions that are swirling around our culture now about the founders and everything. It's not an attempt to take apart, to just demolish and throw away the idea of democracy or a democratic republic. The skepticism is in we know things and we don't even acknowledge that we know them. In fact, we're not going to let people know them. That's not skepticism. It's skepticism of a system that says you can't teach this, you can't say that, you can't make anybody uncomfortable, and so on and so forth. Because it's as much as if to say, if you reveal the knowledge that you have and try to apply it, then something is so fragile it can't possibly function. That's where skepticism can be applied well, but it's very painful.
Yeah. Looking at the history of skepticism, I think the one thing that we didn't cover in the first episode, and I'd just like to shout it out, we have a pretty big international following. We have a lot of listeners in India. One thing that I found was kind of interesting in doing some more research for this episode is, I'm going to butcher the name, but there was a philosophical school of the Ajna, Ajna, and they sort of developed skepticism at the same time as the pre-Socratic Greeks did.
Yes.
And it was sort of a cornerstone of Buddhism. Some of the first disciples of Buddha were from this school, and it influenced a lot of the Buddhist religion.
I'm so glad that you've opened this up, because we will go into this. We're going to talk a lot more of international, of cultural things. We you and I on the side talked about that. But yes, I mean, in Sanskrit, essentially the word for philosophy means seeing. Well, all right. So if philosophy is seeing, then skepticism is trying to clarify one's seeing, right? And across the systems. So remember eudaimonia. We've talked about this before. The Greek idea of a good life. Okay, the Romans had the summum bonum, the great life. But in Sanskrit, you have the Parama Purusha Artha, which is the supreme personal good. And these were developing roughly, some non-Western was before the Western. And that needs to be acknowledged over and over again, even though we've known that. Somehow we know it, we forget it, we come to know it again. But in some cases, it's sort of a parallel development, and it's a very interesting one.
Yeah. I'm really excited about looking at some of the philosophy from different regions.
Yeah.
Because the Greeks are obviously very important, very foundational to a lot of Western philosophical thought. But there almost comes a point where, I mean, if you've been studying long enough, you know. Not everything there is to know about the philosophy itself, because that's an ever evolving process, but the historical tenets of it. And so looking at some of these other cultural philosophies in different parts of the world is refreshing, right? And then it gives you a different perspective on things.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we'll look at some of that stuff in the future, but I wanted to just real quick slip that in there, that
I'm glad you did. Yeah.
That it wasn't just the Greeks, thinking about skepticism back in the day.
Nope.
So we'll ask a couple other speculative questions before we wrap up the show. And the first one is a bit of a doozy. So how do you view skepticism in light of modern quantum physics? So there's a fascinating article this week, right? Talking about how there's a breakthrough in quantum computing, and that the world's most powerful quantum computer is now 99% accurate, right? And in the world of traditional computers, that'd be completely unacceptable. No, you expect to put in calculations and have them come out accurate every time. But in quantum computing, what we found out from the beginning of quantum computing is that we don't really know what's going on. And it comes back to kind of Schrodinger's cat, right? Well, we don't really know what state something is in until we observe it. How do you think that ties in with skepticism, this quantum view of the world?
That's a marvelous question. Didn't know you were going to do that one. Well, I think you've implied I think I hear your response to the question and what you've just said and you correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to know yours. Mine would be that the skeptical approach is kind of embedded in quantum mechanics as a layperson. If I say I understand as a layperson, is to say I don't understand much at all.
Right.
But there are some things that are written so that we can, and as you just described, and so entanglement being another one. So the fact that you can't be absolutely certain means that you need to be asking questions about where the uncertainty lies. Is there a source of the uncertainty? Can that knowledge be built? Is there a way to strengthen the true belief you might have in what an entangled particle does, or whether the cat is, alive or dead? So I think that skepticism, in an odd way, is built into the fabric, the quantum fabric.
I think so too. And, I think that it's just another experience with the other, right? Especially as a layperson. I think as a layperson, we have this temptation to say, well, since we can't understand it, it must just be some purely mathematical thing. And it's not actually how reality works. It's just describing how it works so that we understand it, or this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But that's not true. They've done experimental studies, and they've seen these things actually happen. They've quantumly entangled a living thing, a tardigrade, just recently.
Yes, I've read about that. Yes.
And so when you're confronted with that reality, right, and that, okay, well, things don't necessarily exist in one state at a given time, it really does open up this skeptical course of analysis about the reality that we live in, right? And they're developing theories to try to explain these things. And a lot of it's in its infancy. But we know that quantum physics very, very accurately describes things at small scales. And the same way general relativity is almost irrefutable at large scales, quantum physics is very similar at small scales.
Everything about humanity is in its infancy.
That's true.
I was just delighting in you saying that, because I've had this pet phrase for far too long, and I think students got tired of me saying it when I would say we were barely out of the caves. But this week, to draw on what you're talking about, not only the tardigrade stories, but a footprint of some million years old of essentially humanoid form, proto-human, have been found. All right. Something like us was shambling around the mud long ago, but humanity, in the sense of that we like to speak of it in the sense of having communication, writing, and so on. Well, maybe commerce 30,000 years, maybe the forms of government and social creation of a kind that we might say total humanity, well, several thousand years, and so we talk about things as if they're ancient, but they aren't.
Right.
and quantum stuff, oh my gosh, that's just, wow, it just happened. The bubble just popped up.
Yeah. And it's funny thinking about this sort of thing, and just the effects that it has on us, right? And it's almost a paradigm shift, right? When you realize that, okay, well, how we metaphysically view the universe that we live in might have to change to sort of accommodate these sorts of things, and what that will look like, and what that says about humanity, like our anthropic principle, these sorts of things, and what lays possibly outside of the universe, or possibly before or after, these sorts of things. It raises these huge questions. And so it can raise huge questions like that, but it can also raise small ones. Right before we started podcasting, I got a text message from a friend that said, in your opinion, should the word do we need the word travesty? And I said, no, I don't think we need the word travesty. Need is a strong word. But does the word travesty have a shade of meaning that's not portrayed by its synonyms? Yeah, I think so. So I think a more interesting philosophical question is to ask, with how few words could humanity continue to exist, and would that tangibly shape our cognitive processes, right?
It already is tangibly shaping our cognitive processes, and it's a really interesting email exchange that you just described. We know that people, even though there are more words than ever now, dictionaries expand, word creation is expanding. The overall vocabulary possessed by a standard person in our culture, as an example, has reduced measurably. George Orwell in 1984 had this this picked out already. Let's see, what's the best way to control people? By giving them fewer words, by making them want to not have as many words. So you reduce the dictionary down to a basic level of maybe 10,000 words or 9,000 words is that in that novel, right? But that way, fewer words, fewer shades of meaning, therefore a communication that can be straightforward and used by authoritarians. And so my response would have been different than yours to this extent. Yes, we absolutely need every word we invent. We don't need it because it's a word that was used for the good. We need it as a representative of where our thoughts are going, good, bad, or ill. And we don't need to use it all the time. We need to use it carefully, but to recognize how humanity has developed its intellect collectively, then we need to have those words. They are markers.
Yeah. Because if you look up travesty, right, and you look at synonyms, you have misrepresentation or distortion. That doesn't mean the same thing.
No, there's a quality of travesty that doesn't.
There's almost
embrace those.
And it's almost an ethical overtone, really, that's not portrayed by misrepresentation or distortion.
That's interesting. You just said ethical. I know we're trying to close, but I want to put this out there so we can pick it up on it later, perhaps. But ethics is very much a part of, or has been in some interpretations of skepticism. So a skeptical question, if you're about to sell a house, would be to say, I know that my roof is leaky. Do I have to tell a potential buyer that? Because you have knowledge. What are you going to do with that knowledge? If that knowledge is accurate, then it implies that not sharing that knowledge can then be used to advance you, but not the people who are going to acquire something that you have had. And you can take that right back to what I said before about stretching back to it if you find out truths about your society, whatever society it is, and you are unwilling to examine those truths, then you are perpetuating a hierarchical, privileged structure that is only going to damage a lot of people. So skepticism and ethics interweave.
Yeah. And so we're really seeing how, the pillars of philosophy, right? Skepticism is inextricably linked with knowledge, which is one of those pillars, which is why we didn't decide to dedicate a whole episode to logic, but we did decide to dedicate a second episode to skepticism because they work together so well. One last question, all right? And I have a feeling it might not be short.
You know me. I'll try to be short. You can answer yourself.
Does skepticism have a role in aesthetic or axiological considerations?
Well, I will launch too fast and say yes. How do you know something is beautiful? Is an epistemological question, but the skeptical question would be, and what's justifying that true belief? What underlies that packet of knowledge? Is it in fact knowledge, or is it just assertion? So just for the aesthetics that I think built into that classic beautiful works.
Yeah, see, I think aesthetics is the difficult one, if I'm thinking about it, right? Because it kind of comes back to the Platonic ideals to an extent, right? I think that if we say we can be skeptical aesthetically, it's almost an admission of Platonic ideals, that there is something out there that we're comparing artistic or aesthetic things to. And I'm not sure that is supportable, right? So music, I go back to music because music is my main art form, right? In Western music, we have an idea of what a good song and a bad song is. But that knowledge is based firmly in the chromatic scale, right? But if you travel to India, they don't have a chromatic scale. There aren't distinct intervals between notes. Instruments slide between notes. You have vibrato built into a lot of things. So you can have diatonic, you can have all of these different types of tonal scales. And they may sound strange or dissonant to a Western ear, but for the specific group that's creating the music, that may be a beautiful song. So how we describe, how we apply skepticism, how we question what would make a good song, or or even what makes a song, right? To me, that seems like it should be a difficult thing to establish.
I think it is. And skepticism doesn't imply that answers are going to just be found because the questions have been asked. Skepticism is about asking questions to make sure that one isn't too sure where one shouldn't be. Oh dear.
I told you this is going to be a rough one. Yeah, it's just
so you can be skeptical about people. They perhaps misuse the word, but people are skeptical about art frequently. What it means is art is here's my boundary A and B between what is art and what is not. And it might be a very narrow range. Art is realistic representation, period. None of this abstract and none of this, because I don't call that art. Okay. Well, for an individual, they can establish whatever criterion they want for that. But if you're talking about the whole branch of aesthetics, then it's incumbent to continue asking, well, is there an a priori idealistic, the ideal of what's beautiful through all time, in all circumstances, for humans and for not humans, for nature, or is it possible to ask the questions that lead us to see that what is considered beautiful in a human form has shifted frequently? And if so, do we have a knowledge of what beauty itself is, or do we have a knowledge of what our own shifting definitions of it have been? And so skeptical questions questions asked like this lead us to, well, what's really a true belief and what has been a temporary belief?
Yeah, okay. So that makes sense, right? So rather than looking at skepticism as applying to the output of an artistic form or an aesthetic form, you're instead directing the skepticism inward towards our knowledge and beliefs about how we interpret these artistic things.
I think the inward direction, across the history, we've talked about this, across the history of skepticism internationally, I think the establishment of an inner and an outer, and often it's easier to work with the inner. Easier may not be the best word, but it's more accessible than the outer.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah. I'm really glad we did this episode. I didn't think that I was thinking, it's going to be kind of short and, we're going to rehash a lot of stuff we did in the past. It turned out to be pretty long and we didn't really go over much of anything that we covered in the first episode. So I'm glad that we did it, and it gives me a lot of hope going forward and re-examining some topics that we've looked at in the past. But hopefully next time we'll finish up our series on the pillars of philosophy, and then we'll move on to new ground. So until next time, keep pondering.